There's a pink funny car bolted to the roof of a diner in Maryland. It won a world championship, and I'd put money on the fact that most of you can't tell me the name of the woman who drove it. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the racers that American drag racing decided to leave behind. If you're someone who loves this sport's history, the cars, the quarter mile, the champions whose names somehow never made it onto a magazine cover, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So here's where we start. Maryland International Raceway, Budds Creek, Maryland. At the top of the spectator bleachers there's a concession stand called the Hot Rods Diner. If you've ever been to a Maryland race, you've been there. You order a cheeseburger, maybe a funnel cake, and you eat it standing in the shade while somebody's blower car warms up in the staging lanes below you. Nothing remarkable about that, except for what's sitting on the roof. Bolted down up there, repainted a few times over the years to keep the color honest, is the body of a pink 1986 Chrysler Laser funny car. No chassis, no wheels, no motor, just the fiberglass shell, sitting on a concession stand roof like a weather vane, watching the cars come down the quarter mile. And here's the thing. That body won a world championship. It won an NHRA national event that, until 2008, no woman had ever won in the entire history of American drag racing. The driver almost died in a crash at Beaver Springs in 1995, came back at 52, and kept racing until she was 70. By the time it was over, she was in 6 different halls of fame. And if I asked you right now, without looking it up, to tell me her name, more than half of you would have to stop and think about it for a second. This is a story about why. Look, every sport has its version of this. The person who is objectively, measurably great, who checked every box you'd want a legend to check, and who somehow still slipped through the cracks of how we decide to remember things. But drag racing might be the worst offender of all, and this woman is the proof. Her name was Carol Burkett. Everybody called her Bunny. And to understand why you don't know her, you first have to understand who the sport had already decided its woman was. Because by the time we get to the mid-1980s, American drag racing had a very clear idea of who its women were. There was Shirley Muldowney. And then there was everybody else. You know the Muldowney story. Almost everybody knows the Muldowney story. 3 Top Fuel World Championships by 1982. A 1983 Hollywood biopic with Bonnie Bedelia playing her and Beau Bridges in the other lead. The whole country learned her name, including people in households that had never spent a single dollar at a drag strip in their lives. And here's what most people don't realize about fame and how it actually works. Once Hollywood writes a story down, the culture tends to stop looking for more of it. The slot, woman in nitro drag racing, got filled. Checked off. Done. The narrative had its hero, and the machinery moved on. Shirley herself said as much years later. And the woman we're talking about today said it more clearly than anyone. In her own words, Shirley made the path, and it was pretty narrow. All I did was help widen it. Sit with that line for a second because it's the whole video in one sentence. Shirley made the path. Bunny widened it. And we built statues to the person who made the path and forgot the person who widened it. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but maybe she just wasn't as good. Maybe the reason you don't know her is the simplest reason of all, which is that she didn't win enough to deserve remembering. Hold that thought, because we're going to take it apart piece by piece, and by the end of this you're going to be a little angry about it. I was. Because here's a number that stopped me cold. The gap between the first woman to win a funny car national event and the second one was 22 years. 22. Here's the first thing you need to know. Bunny Burkett never raced Top Fuel. She raced Alcohol Funny Car, what most of you will know as Top Alcohol Funny Car. And in drag racing, there has always been a prestige gap between the two that has almost nothing to do with talent. Top Fuel is the marquee. It's the thing the sport sells to outsiders. Funny Car sits right next to it. And Alcohol Funny Car sits one more rung down from that. It runs on methanol instead of nitromethane. It uses a clutch and a 3-speed transmission, and it tops out somewhere around the 250 mph mark. And here's the part people get wrong. It's not slower because the drivers are worse. It's slower because the class was literally built to be a stepping stone. A proving ground. Most of the men who won championships in alcohol funny car aren't household names either. The people who get remembered in drag racing are the people who run the top classes. That's just the math of it. So before Bunny ever turned a wheel in anger, she was already racing in a category the sport had quietly decided didn't count for legend building. And we haven't even gotten to where she lived, who she raced for, or the sanctioning body she called home. Because all three of those things were about to stack the deck even further against her. West Virginia, 1945. Bunny, born Carol Ruth Hartman, comes into the world in Franklin in May of that year. And her start in life is the kind of Appalachian poverty that doesn't photograph well, the kind nobody makes a movie about. Her father left when she was a year and a half old. She grew up first in a wooden house out in a field, the kind where the wind comes straight through the walls, and then later in a section of town the locals called Dirty Run. Indoor plumbing was a recent development. That's not a figure of speech. That's where she came from. And then the local mill closed. Her stepfather lost his job. And here's where the story starts to feel less like a biography and more like an old folk song. The whole family climbed onto the back of a flatbed truck and drove east until they literally ran out of road. They stopped in Chantilly, Virginia, and took a room in a boarding house next to a rock quarry. Now, here's the detail that changes everything. Dulles Airport was being built a few miles up the road at that time. And a lot of the men doing the construction work were sleeping down the hall in that same boarding house. One of them was a quiet young guy named Maurice Oliver Burkett. Everybody called him Mo. And their first date, in her own telling, was at Old Dominion Dragway in Manassas. That part matters. Hang on to it. Because the rest of her entire life more or less starts at a drag strip on a first date. She married Mo at 16. And here's a thing she said in interviews more than once. She wasn't actually sure about marrying him. So she flipped a coin. That's her telling, not mine. The coin came up Mo. And that was that. 53 years. They bought a 1964 and a half Mustang, brand new, for around $2,500. And look, $2,500 in 1964 was real money. That was a serious purchase. And then a drunk driver plowed into it right in their own driveway and burned it down to the frame. So money's tight, the car's gone, and Bunny needs a plan. And here's where most people's version of this story gets it wrong, so let me be precise. In 1967, she took a job as a hostess at the Baltimore Playboy Club, one of Hefner's satellite operations, and she worked there just long enough to raise money for a new car. Now, you might be thinking you know where this goes. You don't. She wasn't a bunny in the costume sense. The hostesses weren't the headliners. But here's the thing, the nickname came home with her anyway, and it stuck for the next 53 years. Bunny. The woman who'd eventually win a world championship got her racing name from a side job she took to replace a Mustang. And to keep that new Mustang, which they nicknamed Cotton Pony, fed and in fuel, Bunny took a second job at a place called Southern Office Supply. 3 long days a week. She started that in 1968 and ran it for close to 20 years. I want you to really hear this next number because this is where you start to understand what kind of person we're dealing with. Her goal every single week was to clear $85. $85. And here's what $85 had to cover: gas, a motel, hot dogs for her 2 daughters, and entry fees at 3 different drag strips on the same weekend. 3 tracks. Every weekend. That was the math she was running. An office supply job funding a 3-track-a-weekend racing habit, with 2 kids in the car eating hot dogs in the pit. She started in B/stock automatic and moved up through super stock. And a lot of her time in the late 60s and early 70s got spent on something promoters were running called the Miss America of Drag Racing Tour. Later it became the Miss Universe of Drag Racing Tour. If you were at Cecil County or 75 to 80 Dragway or Old Dominion in those years, you saw some version of that show come through. Here's what that was. Bunny, a racer named Carol Henson, and a rotating cast of the other women racing on the East Coast, all matched up against each other in small displacement classes. Booked by promoters who had figured out something pretty cynical, the gate was bigger when there were women on the card. And here's what I want you to understand about that, because this is where it gets interesting. It was work. It paid the bills. It put hot dogs in her daughter's hands. But it is also exactly the kind of thing that does not, under any circumstances, ever show up in a Hall of Fame citation. Nobody writes, veteran of the Miss Universe of Drag Racing Tour on a bronze plaque. That whole chapter, years of it, is invisible to history by design. In 1973, she moved up to pro stock in a Ford Pinto they called Little Cotton Bunny. And she rolled it at Roxborough Dragway in North Carolina when the parachute came out early and fouled the wheelie bars. She walked away from that one. Filed it under Tuesday. In 1976, a Ford dealer named Drake Viscom handed her the keys to a pretty Mustang-bodied alcohol funny car. And here's the honest truth about that car. It looked wonderful at car shows and it was never really tuned to win a race. So she ran it anyway. Because of course she did. And then in 1982, after about 15 years of racing, she got into a Corvette-bodied alcohol funny car that was actually quick. For the first time in her career, she started to scare people. The shy girl from the boarding house, the one selling t-shirts out of a trailer, suddenly had a car under her that could actually go rounds. And that's the moment the real story starts. Because everything up to here was set up. 15 years of grinding, 2 jobs, 3 tracks a weekend, a coin-flip marriage, and a nickname from a Playboy club. Now she had a car. And in just a few years, she was going to do something no woman in the history of American drag racing had ever done. But first, you need to understand the strange, almost invisible corner of the sport she was about to do it in. So let's talk about where she did it. Because the where matters almost as much as the what. By the early 1980s, the class had consolidated into something you'd recognize today. The old Pro Comp umbrella, where alcohol funny cars used to share a championship with alcohol dragsters and whatever else was floating around, that had been broken up. The NHRA was running top alcohol funny car as its own standalone category. And the IHRA, headquartered down in Bristol, Tennessee, would follow in 1986 with the very first standalone IHRA Alcohol Funny Car World Championship. Remember that year? 1986, the first year that title existed at all. Write it on your hand. Now, here's the part of this story that doesn't get nearly enough credit, and it's the single biggest reason you don't know her name. So I want to slow all the way down here. For those of you who are NHRA loyalists, and I know you're out there, the IHRA was always that other sanction. Smaller, southern skewing, Bristol-based, with a fan base heavy in the Carolinas, the Mid-Atlantic, and Tennessee. And look, the IHRA was no joke. It ran Top Fuel. It ran Funny Car. It ran Mountain Motor Pro Stock, which is its own beautiful, insane thing. And it produced a whole lot of world champions you've simply never heard of. Not because they weren't great, but because the IHRA never had NHRA's media reach. Here's the way one person put it, and it stuck with me. If you won an IHRA title, you knew it. The readers of Drag Review knew it. The guys running the concession stands knew it. The Philadelphia Inquirer? Did not know. Did not care. Never found out. And Bunny was IHRA coded down to her bones. She ran both sanctions when she could afford to, but her bread and butter was the match race circuit across the IHRA-aligned tracks up and down the East Coast. The ones you've driven to. Rockingham, Darlington, Bristol, Martin, Echo, Maple Grove, Beaver Springs, Maryland International, Cecil County. About 50 bookings a year, plus whatever national event swings she could afford to make. So let's add up what we've got so far, because the picture is coming into focus. She raced a Class 1 rung below the marquee. She raced primarily in the smaller of the two sanctioning bodies. She was based 900 miles from the Southern California media complex that was writing most of the sports mythology in those years. She had a husband, 2 daughters, and a day job in a transmission shop, and she ran her entire operation out of a small trailer. Here's the thing. If you sat down and tried to design, from scratch, a driver guaranteed to get overlooked by the machinery that decides what racing we remember, you would have designed Bunny Burkett. Every single variable, dialed to, forgotten. Oh, and one more. The one that's genuinely hard to explain. She had no major sponsor. None. No t-shirt brand. No cigarette deal. No oil company. No beer. She had Mo, she had 2 daughters, she had the transmission shop they were running out of their property in Northern Virginia, and she had whatever small associate deals she could scrape together. Her own family, writing about it years later on her website, said they had no idea why no major sponsor ever signed her. Their words, to me, they are missing the boat. Hold on to that, because we're going to come back to it and it's going to make you genuinely mad. But in 1985, 2 things happened that changed the entire weight of her career. First, a man named Bill Mathias, a racer and businessman she'd been working with, agreed to put real money behind a brand new car. Real money. For the first time. And second, and this is one of my favorite details in the whole story, Bunny and Mo got onto a commercial airline flight to California to go see a legendary chassis builder named Dave IHRA. Now, here's the part. They didn't have the money to ship the race car parts out west. So you know what they did? They packed the parts into their suitcases and flew the parts out themselves. On a passenger plane. As luggage. Let me just sit in that for a second because it tells you everything. This is a future world champion, checking funny car components at the airline counter to save on freight. That is the budget she was operating on the year before she beat 3 Hall of Famers. What IHRA built for them was a brand new alcohol funny car. Chrysler Laser body. Pink paint. The lettering down the side read, Mathias and Burkett. Under the body was a 540 cubic inch Hemi, 3-speed, drinking methanol. A guy named Bill Barrett was the crew chief. And they rolled it out for the very first time at the 1986 IHRA Winter Nationals at Darlington, the season opener for a lot of the class. Now, here's what I want you to predict before I tell you. Brand new car. Never raced. Not shaken down. Not qualified mid-pack on a learning curve. First weekend out, ever. What do you think happens? She won the race. She won it on the car's very first weekend out. No shakedown passes that counted, no easing into it. New car, new body, new everything, and she put it in the winner's circle the first time the wheels hit a track. That was February of 1986. And here's where it gets really interesting, because that win was just the opening note. The rest of that season is about to become one of the most quietly historic campaigns any woman ever put together in this sport, and almost nobody outside the East Coast IHRA world ever found out it happened. At the IHRA national event in Martin, Michigan, she won. At the IHRA race at Rockingham, North Carolina, she won. By the second half of the season, the points picture had tightened down to just 2 drivers. Bunny and a racer named Greg Moss. And remember, the IHRA had never had a standalone alcohol funny car world championship before in its entire history. 1986 was the first year it existed. So when the points got tallied at the end of that season, somebody's name was going to go in the record book as the first one ever. The first IHRA alcohol funny car world champion in history. That name was Bunny Burkett. A woman had won a world championship in a funny car for the first time in the history of American drag racing. And here's the wild part. That wasn't even the biggest thing she did that year. Because in October of that same year, she loaded up the pink Laser and drove it up to Maple Grove Raceway, just outside Reading, Pennsylvania, for the NHRA Keystone Nationals. Now, different sanction. This is NHRA now, the big one, the one with National Dragster and the cable deals and the media reach. The other lane in the final round belonged to a driver named Peter Gallant. And most of you who were there that weekend might not remember the race itself by heart, but I guarantee you remember the place. Maple Grove in the fall. The whole valley full of cars. The smell of the leaves mixing with the methanol coming off the starting line. There's nothing else like it. Bunny beat Gallant. And in doing it, she became the first woman in the entire history of the NHRA to win any kind of funny car national event. Any kind. Not alcohol-specific, not an asterisk. The first woman, period. Now here's the number I told you to write on your hand. Here's the one that I think actually tells the whole story better than anything else in this video. Nobody else did it again. No woman won an NHRA funny car national event of any kind, until Ashley Force Hood broke through in the Nitro class in 2008. Do that subtraction with me. 1986 to 2008. That's a 22-year gap. 22 years between Bunny's win at the Keystone and the next woman to do it. An entire generation of drag racing came and went in that gap. Kids who weren't born when Bunny won were old enough to drive by the time the second one happened. And here's what most people don't realize. When Ashley Force did it in 2008, it was a genuine national story. Cameras everywhere. And it should have been. But almost nobody connected it back to the woman who'd done the same thing 22 years earlier in a pink Chrysler with parts that had flown to California as checked luggage. And the Keystone wasn't even the end of her 1986. Let me just run the full tally for you, because it's almost absurd. The IHRA World Championship, the NHRA Keystone Nationals, the NHRA Division II Championship, which she locked up with wins at Warner Robins, DeSoto, and West Palm Beach. And she finished fourth in NHRA Top Alcohol Funny Car national points for the entire year. Now look at who finished ahead of her in those national points. Frank Manzo, Pat Austin, Brad Anderson, 3 Hall of Famers. That was her cohort. That's the company she was keeping in 1986. Fourth behind 3 men who are enshrined, celebrated, remembered. And she's on a diner roof. Brett Kepner, and if you don't know that name, he called drag racing from the tower for about 40 years and forgets almost nothing, has said that in 1985 and 86, Bunny Burkett was, in his words, an absolute killer. A genuine hitter. And here's how he described the trick of her, talking to Competition Plus. She had molded this whole persona, the demure, kind of shy, I'm just a girl from down the street thing. But deep down inside her, he said, there was a stone-cold competitive drag racer trying to take your head off the second the helmet went on. So now we're at the part of the story where, if history worked the way it's supposed to work, the phone starts ringing. Right? This is the moment. World champion. National event winner. First woman ever to do it. Photogenic, marketable, a natural in front of a camera. This is where the sponsor shows up. This is where Hot Rod magazine wants her on the cover. This is where National Dragster puts her on a poster. This is where somebody in Detroit finally cuts a check and gets their logo on the side of that car. This is where some producer in Hollywood asks whether there's a script in this, the same way there'd been a script in Shirley. Here's what actually happened. None of it. None of that happened. Not one piece of it. What happened instead is that Bill Barrett's health gave out after the 1986 season. And the Matthias partnership dissolved right along with it. So the 1987 campaign opened up without a real team and without real money. The whole apparatus that had carried her to that championship just evaporated within months of her winning it. And by the late 1980s, Bunny was right back where she'd been before the championship ever happened. She was a match racer again. 50 bookings a year. Souvenirs in the trailer. The 540 in the back. Meeting fans after every single round and signing every autograph anybody stuck in front of her until the last one was gone. So you want to know why you don't remember this? Here's the honest answer. You don't remember it because the machinery that makes people remembered never got turned on for her. That's it. That's the whole thing. She won the championship. She won the national event. She finished ahead of people whose names absolutely did get remembered. And the entire sports memory writing apparatus, the magazines, the television deals, the sponsors, the Hollywood types, looked straight past her at the next thing. Not because she failed, because the spotlight was pointed somewhere else, and nobody ever swung it her way. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but that's one good year. Maybe 1986 was a fluke. Maybe she peaked and faded and that's a normal career arc, nothing tragic about it. Fair. So let's look at what came after, because the years between 1987 and 1995 are the ones most people, if they remember Bunny at all, remember as one long blur of match races. And mostly that's accurate. But it wasn't all blur. The 1991 season produced 2 more national event wins. The IHRA Winter Nationals at Darlington again, and the IHRA US Open Nationals. And here's a detail I love. At Darlington, she beat a driver named Mark Thomas in the final. Remember that name, because Mark Thomas would go on to win 7 IHRA Alcohol Funny Car Championships of his own. 7. And he is one of the very few men in this entire story who will say, flat out, on the record, that Bunny belonged in the same conversation as any of them. She debuted a new Dodge Daytona body on the IHRA chassis that year. The Daytona ran a best of 6.118. Quick car. Genuinely quick. But the truth is, by then the 1986 window had already closed. By 93 and 94 she was still fast, still booked, still selling t-shirts out the back of the trailer, but she wasn't a championship contender anymore. And the thing is, she didn't seem to be slowing down. She and Mo started building out a brand new car for the 1995 season. A fresh Dodge Avenger body, same basic powertrain underneath, ready for another decade of racing. She was 50 years old and building a new car. That's not someone winding down. That's someone planning to run another title. And that's exactly what makes what happened next so hard to talk about. 4:44 p.m. Labor Day weekend, 1995. Bunny takes the new Avenger up to Beaver Springs Dragway in central Pennsylvania for something called the Fall Funny Car Classic. Let me set the scene, because the place matters. Beaver Springs sits up in Snyder County, Pennsylvania, right in the middle of farm country. It's a small track. In 1995 it was run by a guy named Bob Cardle, and the Fall Funny Car Classic was a match race weekend, exactly the kind of thing Bunny would book without thinking twice about it. Good money. Loyal crowd. Close enough to home to make it a weekend trip with Mo. Routine. As routine as launching a methanol-burning funny car down a quarter-mile ever get. The other car in her pairing that afternoon was a Crown Victoria-bodied funny car driven by a man named Carl Ruth. Now, here's where I have to be careful, because what happened between Ruth's car and Bunny's car has been told a couple of different ways over the years, and the versions don't entirely agree. So I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what every party did. I'm going to tell you only what we know for certain. At around the 1,000-foot mark, so deep into the run, near the top end, both cars moving, the two cars touched. Some accounts say Ruth's car drifted over and clipped her wheelie bars. The Washington Post, reporting the next day, said Ruth's car veered into her lane and hit her on the side. The accounts differ on exactly how. They don't differ on the result. The Avenger got turned. Bunny corrected left, got into the right guardrail, and the car launched. And here's the detail that turns a bad crash into a catastrophe. Beaver Springs in 1995 did not have guardrails the full length of the track. Past a certain point, the shoulder just gave way to trees, and Bunny's Avenger came off that right wall and catapulted into the trees at somewhere around 220 miles an hour. It flipped as it went, and it came apart. Emergency crews got to her fast, but getting her out of the wreckage took about 25 minutes. They flew her by helicopter to a trauma center. Here's a thing she said in interviews, more than once, for the rest of her life. She was pronounced dead 3 separate times that afternoon. Once on the stretcher, and twice more in the air. 3 times. And she'd come back to talk about it. She was in a coma for 3 weeks. And the list of injuries. Look, I'll read it, but I want to warn you it's the kind of list you don't really want to hear. 2 broken vertebrae. A broken wrist. A broken ankle. A hairline skull fracture. Head trauma that lasted. And this is the part that stayed with her the rest of her life, every single day of it. Steel rods in her back. A paralyzed midsection. Loss of bladder and bowel control. A permanent limp. She was 50 years old. So here's the honest math of that crash, and it's the cruelest part of this whole story. It didn't end her career. We'll get to the fact that she raced for nearly 20 more years. What the crash ended was the career that could have ever caught up to the spotlight, because in 1995 she was still competitive, still booked, still picking up wins. The whole point of the new Avenger was a run at another title. And instead, the season became a coma, a year of recovery, and a body that would never work right again. By the time she was physically able to even think about chasing national recognition once more, the window was shut and she was past 50. Now, this is the part where most people's stories end. 50 years old, paralyzed midsection, steel rods in the back, in and out of a wheelchair for about a year. Anyone would understand if that was the last chapter. Here's what Mo said. He's sitting across from her one day during the recovery, and he says this, and it gets quoted a lot, because it is exactly the kind of thing a husband who'd spent 30 years of evenings turning wrenches on his wife's race car would say. He said, "I guess the only thing that's going to get you out of that wheelchair is another funny car. So let's build you one. So let's build you one." And they did. In 1996, just so she wouldn't lose her streak of having driven a race car every single year since the mid-1960s, she made one ceremonial pass down a drag strip in a little girl's junior dragster. A junior dragster. The world champion, the woman who got launched into the trees at 220, making sure the streak stayed alive by idling down the track in a kid's car. That's not ego. That's identity. That's somebody saying, I am a drag racer, and I will be a drag racer this year too, even if this is all my body will let me do. In 1997, she rolled out a brand new Dodge Avenger alcohol funny car for the NHRA Keystone Nationals at Virginia Motorsports Park. First pass back in a real car, 6.43 at well over 200 miles an hour. 2 years removed from being pronounced dead 3 times, with steel rods in her back, she ran a 6.43. And the crowd stood up for her. Of course they did. But here's the cost of it. Here's the part that should make you angry, because we flagged it earlier and now it comes due. In the spring of 1997, she sold her transmission shop, the family business, the thing they ran their whole operation out of, to pay the medical bills from Beaver Springs. And then, in April of 1999, Mo was let go from a job he'd held for 36 years, a foreman position, because the family's insurance premiums had gotten too expensive for the company to carry. So just line that up. A world champion. The first woman to win an NHRA funny car national event. And the way the bills got paid was selling the family business and watching her husband lose a 36-year job over insurance costs. There was no sponsor logo on the side of that car to absorb any of it. There never had been. The blank space on the door panel wasn't just a missed marketing opportunity. It was the difference between keeping the shop and selling it. They kept racing anyway. Of course they did. The Washington Post ran a feature on her in July of 2000 that laid all of this out. The crash, the rods, the sold shop, the lost job. And it's one of the only times a mainstream American newspaper ever wrote her up at any real length. Think about that. It took nearly dying and going broke for the mainstream press to spend a column on a woman who'd won a world championship 14 years earlier. And here's where it gets really interesting, because she didn't stop. Not in 2000. Not for a long time after. because she raced that Avenger and then another Avenger after it, on and off for the next 18 years. 18. Her last national event final round came at Cecil County Dragway in 2004. Her last full season was 2015, when she was 70 years old. And she didn't just limp through it. She billed that year as her 50th anniversary tour. 50 years of driving a race car, celebrated on track at 70. And by the time she got there, look at what she'd already survived just to keep showing up. Breast cancer and a mastectomy. A hysterectomy. Another form of cancer entirely. A broken leg. A hip replacement. She'd buried friends. And she kept racing through all of it. Here's how she put it herself, in her own words, written for her website. And I want to read this one carefully because it's her, not me. I have died, had breast cancer, a mastectomy, hysterectomy. I have fell and broke my leg, had a hip replacement, had another form of cancer, but every single time all I could think of is getting back in that car. I had commitments and I had my fans. I had my fans. That was the point for her. Always. Royce Miller, who ran Maryland International Raceway for 25 years and had a front row seat to all of this, said she stayed at the back of her trailer after every single round, for as long as it took, until the very last person in line had an autograph. That was her business model. And it was also just who she was. There wasn't any daylight between the two. Aaron Polburn, who ran the IHRA from 2004 to 2014 and watched her work up close, put it like this. She was a drag racing entertainer before we as promoters knew we were in the entertainment business. And you can hear the whole tragedy of it sitting right there in that sentence. Because here's the cruel paradox of Bunny Burkett. While she was winning championships, and then long after she stopped winning them, she was doing the exact thing that makes you beloved by a sport and forgotten by its history at the same time. She was selling to the fans, shaking hands, signing hats, talking to an 8-year-old about her pink car at the back of a trailer. Meanwhile, the drivers who put their cars in glass cases and hired publicists and chased the coverage windows at the big national events, those are the drivers who got the magazine covers. Bunny was never going to get a cover, because Bunny was always at the back of the trailer with the last kid in line. That generosity was the very thing the history-writing machinery couldn't see. The recognition did come, eventually. Most of it regional. Most of it late. In 2009, the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame. In 2010, the Maryland International Raceway Hall of Fame. And it was right around then that Mir took her 1986 championship Chrysler Laser body, that same pink shell, and bolted it to the roof of the brand-new Hot Rods diner. Then the Super Stock Hall of Fame. The Little Guys Nationals Hall of Fame. The York U.S. 30 Legion of Honor. Drag Racing List ranked her the #1 female alcohol funny car driver in history. 6 halls of fame when it was all counted. And here's the part one keep coming back to. Carol Burkett is not a member of the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America. She is not a member of the Automotive Hall of Fame. Shirley Muldowney is in both. And those two institutions are the ones that confer the kind of recognition that crosses out of the sport and into American memory at large. The plaque somebody in Detroit hangs on a wall, the line that shows up in a New York Times obituary. Muldowney has them. Bunny doesn't. And in all the research that went into this, I could not find any sign that anybody ever seriously tried to put her up for either one. The sport remembered her. The country didn't. On April 4th of 2020, a Saturday morning, Carol Burkett died in her sleep at home at 74 of what was reported as natural causes. The celebration of her life got delayed by the pandemic. And in 2023, 3 years after she was gone, the Don Garlits Museum's International Drag Racing Hall of Fame finally inducted her. The class that year included John Force. It was the most prestigious honor she ever received, and she'd been dead 3 years when it came. So here's where we end up. There's a concession stand at Maryland International Raceway called the Hot Rods Diner. And on its roof sits a pink Chrysler Laser funny car body. That body won the first ever IHRA Alcohol Funny Car World Championship. That body won the NHRA Keystone Nationals, and made the woman driving it the first woman in NHRA history to win any funny car national event, and the only one for the next 22 years. And it's worth saying plainly, because it's almost too perfect to be real. The championship car ended up exactly where a sponsor logo would have gone, in a sport where the sponsor logos never came. It ended up doing promotional work for cheeseburgers. It ended up holding up a roof. She wasn't overlooked because the racing wasn't good enough. She was overlooked because the world that decides which racing gets remembered was looking somewhere else the entire time she was winning. She knew that. And she raced anyway. That's the part I'd want you to take with you. The pink laser that should have been in a museum is up on a diner roof in Budds Creek, watching the cars go by. That's where they put her. And she'd have liked that part, actually. That's the honest truth. She'd have said the fans can see it better from up there. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the champions the cameras missed. Subscribe, hit the thumbs up, and I'll keep digging them up. This is Legacy Motoring. Thanks for watching.